and many other wonderful things. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andrew Clark.
Good afternoon. This thing working? So, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be back here in Atlanta. It's been a couple of years since I've been here. And I guess that it's my job right now to sum up these incredible 2 days of learning. Can I just say my notes are not on the front slide, by the way? So I'm going to add some of my own experiences and reflections as somebody who makes websites for a living. We've heard about some really important topics this last couple of days. Thank you. Jeffrey spoke about making experiences that are delightful for people. And you know, that's why I like to work in design. Samantha explained style tiles, and Jason's nimble process mirrors my own experiences quite a lot. Luke doesn't ever fail to amaze me with his insights this week about how to design better cross-browser, cross-screen experiences. And then Jason Grigsby explained why mobile-first responsive design matters so much. And then Jared put everything into context of doing business. And man, that was only on day one. Today we heard from Kevin about service design thinking. Jen explained how designers and developers can work more effectively together. Jake got all nerdy on the subject of HTTP requests. And then Sarah talked about designing with data. And then finally, Matt taught us about responsive images. And I think we're all going to take away a lot from everything that we've heard. So when I gave this talk a title, I called it A Modern Designer's Canvas because originally I was going to talk about the tools and the processes that I use when I'm designing. But to be honest, everybody else just said it a lot better than I could. And also, being a good designer or a good developer is much more than knowing how to use tools or following within a process. It's also about the way that we approach what we do. And it's about our attitude towards it. So I'm going to talk about 4 lessons that can help us be better at what we do. And these have been important to me, especially over the last few challenging years when what we do to make websites every day has changed so much. And these are lessons that I learned a very long time ago at art school. And they're about finding your medium, finding the medium that best expresses your talents and your ideas. Not getting intoxicated by a process or falling in love with tools. And then learning to challenge everything that we've heard, including everything that we've heard here at this conference. And most importantly of all, beating our own path rather than walking someone else's. So I'm going to do this talk without slides, just in case you think the projector's broken. Or the AV guys have gone to the pub. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to publish a transcript. It's going to be on the slides URL after I've given the talk. But before we get to that, is it anybody's birthday today? No? What? There is one person. Whoa. Excellent. Do you know, you share your birthday with some pretty serious celebrities, I think. Really? It is John Travolta's birthday today. He's obviously staying alive. Dr. Dre, it's his birthday today. He's 48 today, same as me. He looks a lot older though, don't you think? It's Yoko Ono's birthday today. She's 80 years old today. Why am I telling you this? Well, really, it's because it's also 30 years, oh man, I can't believe this, 30 years, give or take a week or two, since I applied to go to art school. And that was back, to save you doing the math, that was 1984. So, you know, it's really funny thinking back. In 84, we thought about the British government spying on our own citizens was some kind of dystopian future fiction. How little we knew back then. Anyway, what I learned at art school and the things that have stayed with me over those 20-something years since I graduated, these have been the lessons that have helped me get started in this business, something which wasn't even on the horizon back in '84. And they're lessons that helped me adapt so that I could stay in business when the business of making websites has changed so dramatically. And they're lessons that also allow me to take risks with my business. Risks including adopting web standards and responsive design before a lot of people around me were doing that. So art school taught me a lot, but honestly, I can say that it was a very humbling experience because, like a lot of people, I suppose, I'd come from a small town school where I'd always been in that top tier for art. And I was one of only 2 people that went on to study art at university. And when I got there, I just felt like everybody around me was better than I was. And I imagine it's how a lot of people feel when they come to a conference like this. You know, we're the experts in something where we work, but we come to an event like this and everybody seems to know more than we do. You know, sometimes I feel like that when I read an article about some new language or technique and I think I should know this. I don't think I'm the only person that will likely feel that way. Now, technology is supposed to make our lives less stressful, but it's hard to think of another industry where what we do changes so regularly. Do you ever think about doing something else? Not working on the web? Yeah. Me, I think I'm going to be a blacksmith. Right, that's what I'm going to go do. Because, you know, being a blacksmith, you stick something into a fire, make it hot, and then you hit it. Right, you hit it with a hammer. And I doubt that the techniques and the technologies that are used for smithing have changed that much for hundreds of years, have they? You know, you heat something up, you hit it. It can't be very hard. I'm going to get letters from angry blacksmiths for saying that. On the web, though, things change constantly. And I've got to admit, I'm more confused now than I ever have been before about what to learn. I mean, it's hard not to get stressed by the thought that we have to learn or aspire somehow to be an expert in just about everything. And sometimes that stress can turn into a mild panic when everybody else seems to know something that we don't. When I started designing, I used FrontPage and then Dreamweaver. And one of the biggest changes that I made to what I do was at the start of the web standards movement when I learned to write HTML and CSS. And I know a lot of other designers did the same thing. But some people think that that's not good enough anymore. It's not enough anymore. Jeff Croft wrote back in January, what we may not have realized is that once browsers don't suck, being an HTML and CSS guru isn't really a very marketable skill. Well, that's hardly reassuring, is it? Diversify or die, he said, and then pointed out that front-end developers are going for interview are just as likely to be grilled on Backbone or Angular or Node as they are about HTML and CSS. But honestly, does every front-end developer need to learn Backbone or Angular or Node? What about designers like me? You know, I learned to write HTML and CSS because I needed them to express the designs that I made. Code became my medium because designing became more than making artists' impressions of websites. You know, some of my technically inclined friends, they came to those same languages after they'd learned programming. So although we both know HTML and CSS, their working knowledge is very different to mine. You know, they know programming languages. They understand JavaScript. They're comfortable in the command line. They're the sort of technically minded people who understand Backbone or Angular or Node. They're people like Jake. You know, I couldn't write a script if my life depended on it. You know, imagine being taken hostage and kept in a cave like Tony Stark at the beginning of Iron Man. And some geezer says to you, "You will write a carousel plugin." Right? I'm in serious trouble. I mean, not even my advanced knowledge of blacksmithing is going to get me out of that one. That's because my mind works in different ways, and I have a different working knowledge, and that comes from my background in art and design. So I'm not going to know backbone, but I'm a devil with a Bezier curve. So assuming that someone has the same knowledge of you just because they share common languages, like HTML and CSS, that can leave people baffled. But I see those same assumptions being made in articles and tutorials time and time again. You know, I don't have a mind for development, so I never feel under any pressure to learn new development tools or technologies unless they're directly relevant to the work that I'm making, things like SAS. And I bet that there's a very strong likelihood that if you're a designer, you probably won't even ever need to know what a grunt runner is. I thought a grunt runner was like Roadrunner. Sadly, it isn't. But designers have felt under pressure to learn about tools and technologies that have traditionally been the province of those of us who are more technically minded. But at the same time, we might also feel pressure to learn about subjects that have their roots in other academic areas. Subjects like information architecture or content strategy, research, or maybe even analysis of data. But do we need to be experts in these areas to be good designers? You know, it's easy to feel disheartened when you think that simply designing isn't enough, or that making something beautiful is somehow a superficial endeavor. You know, if you feel that way, then I'm with you. But we should always remember that making something beautiful takes knowledge and experience. Understanding proportions and ratios for layout, knowing color principles, and seeing typography, really seeing it. These aren't things that you can learn overnight. So far from being superficial, making a website pretty is still a skill that we should be immensely proud of. And it's also one that's going to be in demand long after the latest fashionable development framework's been forgotten. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't learn new things, or that we should stay within our comfort zone. What matters is finding the right medium to express our ideas and our talents. So we'll likely not need to learn everything, but we will need to learn to be great at the things that we do. Jeffrey wrote recently, "Now may be the time to up your game as a graphic designer or an experienced designer or a front-end developer." He said, "Diversify or die," might seem like overstating it a bit, but follow the path you love will always be good advice. And if you follow the path you love, you'll find your medium, although it might not be where you expect it to be. When I went to art school, I thought that I was going to be a brilliant painter. That's because in high school, painting was as much about precision and about predictability as it was about creativity. You know, high school art classes were about learning techniques so that students could reproduce a painting of something that we likely painted several times before, but this time under exam conditions. And yes, Sarah spoke today about designing with data so that we can produce designs that are predictable. And predictability is something that a lot of people crave. And that sometimes makes them lean on data rather than relying on their own intuition. You know, personally, I want to see designs that are inspirational before I ever see designs that are predictable. You know, this current trend for flat design makes me feel quite nostalgic because I painted flat because I loved hard-edged pop art. I also love David Hockney's work, especially those splash paintings, if you're familiar with those. But I'd only ever seen them reproduced in books, and they're obviously a lot smaller in a book, but also the printing process flattens them. It removes the depth and the subtlety. And I didn't realize that until I actually saw the paintings in real life in a gallery. So what I discovered when I reached art school was that I was actually a pretty lousy painter, especially when I compared myself to all my new peers. Because unlike them, when I painted, everything just ended up looking flat. It doesn't matter what the subject matter was. It wasn't just the content that I'd chosen, it was my technique, and that said as much about me as it did about what I was painting. And we hear a lot today about the benefits of iterating a design. Well, it's an approach that we recommend to all our clients. But then, I couldn't let a painting develop over a period of time while I worked across a whole canvas. I couldn't trust in low fidelity, the sort of low fidelity that we see in grey box wireframes. I didn't have the faith or the patience to iterate. What I needed to do was to start working in high fidelity right from the start. And today's equivalent would be skipping over sketching, moving straight into making a high fidelity design in Photoshop. So what I did was I worked on one part of a painting until it looked finished, and then I'd move on to the next part. It was like painting by numbers. And I kept my eyes so close to the canvas that I couldn't see what the whole painting looked like from a distance. I missed seeing the whole because I was so focused on the parts. And as a result, my paintings, they didn't just look flat, they were disjointed. And this is something that I'm seeing in web design today. You know, it took me months of dissatisfaction with painting to realize that painting wasn't my medium. I didn't have the temperament. I wasn't suited to painting, and it wasn't the right medium for me to communicate my ideas. But I was really fortunate because the fine art degree that I was studying was unstructured, and what that meant was, after the first few weeks of induction, we were left as unsupervised as we wanted to be. There wasn't any timetable. There weren't any lectures. There wasn't any set work except one dissertation, which I wrote about Batman. We got there, we got to art school, and the tutors said, hello. And then 3 years later, they came back and said, so what did you do? And this lack of structure allowed students to move between disciplines, between painting and sculpture and printmaking and photography, whenever we wanted to. But this lack of supervision, it didn't suit everyone. If someone wasn't highly motivated, if they didn't know their path or what their medium was, they often floundered. Some people couldn't cope at all, so they switched to a course that offered more direction. Other people just left altogether. What a few people did was they moved into the life drawing room, and they never left. And they spent 3 years drawing flabby flesh because they craved the predictability, the reliability that life in the life room gave them. And they became incredibly technically proficient, as you might expect. But proficiency doesn't guarantee good art, and it doesn't guarantee good design either. Let's talk about not getting drunk on process or falling in love with tools. You know, at high school, we're taught that there's only one right answer to something. You know, our entire education system, some might say our entire political system, is built on the foundation that there's only an answer that's right or wrong. So something either is or it isn't. It either happened or it didn't. Something's either possible or it's not. And we need things to be right. So we try to find the one right way to do something. It's one of the reasons why we come to conferences. We want to know the right, best way to work with responsive images. We want to know if scalable icon fonts are what we should use. We want to discover the best process for developing websites in this modern responsive era. You know, we want to create systems that make their outcomes predictable. But what if there is no right way to work with responsive images? What if scalable icon fonts are useful, Sometimes. What if there's no best process for responsive design? What if a system hinders the creative process? You know, Samantha wrote about style tiles in a list apart in 2012, and she said, style tiles are the cornerstone of a solid design system that sets client expectations and communicates the visual theme to all project team members. Now, I've been writing about avoiding setting the wrong expectations for a few years. In fact, in particular, I wrote about how when we use the processes and tools and the artifacts that we brought with us to the web from historical media, when we use those inappropriately, they can hinder communication and they can reinforce the wrong expectations. So since the earliest days of the web, designers, we've been using graphic tools like Photoshop or Fireworks or lately Sketch to create these full-page visuals that attempt to demonstrate how a browser will look when it reaches a design will look like when it reaches the browser. So often designers will create visuals of dozens of templates or pages. And these comps, these PSDs or flat static visuals, these high-fidelity design artifacts, they haven't only been used for creative expression and for experimenting, they've actually become the currency of web design. That's because designers exchange them with clients for approval and then for money. Clients and designers exchange them with developers to be used as blueprints for the content or the functionality of a site. And then finally they're used as QA tools. But despite their popularity and longevity, they're actually terribly ill-equipped for any of those roles. These static visuals are bringing a knife to a gunfight. They can only communicate something which is superficial, artificial. They're high fructose, extra sweet, but even though they've got very little nutritional value, people love them, they crave them, they want more. You know, we designers, we've largely learned to live with all of these deficiencies, and we offset them against our familiarity with the tools that we use to make them. But worse than any deficiency is the absence of communication that often goes when we hand over a visual to someone and ask them to judge it. Because instead of using visuals as aids to communication, we often try to let them do our talking for us. And this happens especially when we email them or we upload them to Basecamp with some vague request for thoughts. You know, when we hide behind design artifacts in this way, we leave a tremendous amount open to misinterpretation. And because of that, we're far more likely to set the wrong expectations. That's because the type rendering will look different on a real device. Fonts will not be exactly that size on all devices, and layout is obviously going to be different at various viewport widths. So what are our goals when we show someone, usually a client, a static visual? And once we're past the feedback stages, we're likely looking for approval, for someone to sign off a design. And we need that approval so that we can either conclude our business or signify that a design's ready to move to another phase. Of course, we're not really asking people to judge that visual at all, are we? In reality, we're asking someone to look beyond the visual and to judge what they extrapolate from it will be the look of the finished web page. In effect, what we're saying is, here's a better than artist's impression. And for their judgment to be at all meaningful, we therefore need to make our visuals of the highest fidelity. You know, ideally, we'd like them to look identical to a screenshot of the final web page. When we use visuals to get sign-off, we're implying that the finished web page will ultimately be a facsimile of that visual. It'll be a carbon copy, a clone. And if that's not what we're saying, then what was the point in asking someone to approve it anyway? Have you ever wondered, responsive websites apart, why so many web pages are fixed, width, and centered in the viewport? Do you think that's got anything to do with the fact that the client signed off a fixed-width visual? I'd say that there's a direct result, one or the other. I'd probably go further and I'd say that asking for sign-off on visuals should be considered harmful because we're reinforcing this outdated notion that a web page should be a facsimile of a frozen image. We've been suffering from the effects of this notion for years. Because when we're asked for sign-off on a frozen image, we immediately leave ourselves open to the problems that come when we later have to implement that design. Think back to the number of times you had to explain to a client why Internet Explorer didn't render border radii, or box shadows, or columns, or gradients. Think about how many hours you wasted employing polyfills to prop up an aging browser, just so it could live up to the promise that you made when you sold someone the visual. So to save ourselves this agony, for years, we designed to the lowest common denominator browser in our support matrix. We eschewed so many useful CSS properties until the dominance of those legacy browsers had faded. My Hardboard Web Design book was all about how to challenge that kind of unambitious thinking. Now, one of the things I admire about Samantha's process is that she emphasizes communication. And she said that style tiles provide a catalyst for discussion, and I really appreciate that. Because what matters most is often not the way that we design, but the way that we communicate it. You know, I talked earlier about finding the right medium, and it became very clear to me that these high-fidelity visuals that represent almost the future look of a complete web page, they're rarely the right medium for communicating web design. When a visual encapsulates everything about a design, instead of helping us find clarity, that visual provokes multiple conversations about different topics all at the same time. You know, we might want to talk about typography with a client, but instead they're going to be drifting across the page because they've been distracted by the size of the logo, right? You know, other times we might want to talk about color as part of an interaction vocabulary, but they can't help noticing the out-of-date product photo. People become too easily distracted and conversations become unfocused when we show the totality of a design too soon. And I've been searching for a better way to communicate designs, and I found that it's incredibly helpful to separate design into several components. And I found that since I've done that, I've had more focused and more productive conversations about design. So how often have you heard someone say, "Oh, I don't like the design"? Did you dig deeper and find that it wasn't any of the details that they objected to? It wasn't the typefaces or the way that you'd use color. No, it was just the fact that they wanted the sidebar on the left rather than on the right. And people often comment on the layout aspect of a design, but they express their criticism of design as a whole. They conflate layout with look and feel, and they call it design. And we do it too, as designers, because we're used to making and demonstrating visuals that include all of those things. But now it's time to discuss non-layout and layout elements of design separately. And this means that the look and feel of individual components and how they're arranged on a grid, they're now two separate design challenges. And whereas layout will undoubtedly change across responsive screen sizes, the look and feel of a component, it'll almost certainly stay the same. So if we take away layout, what we're left with is what I've described as the atmosphere of a design. An atmosphere describes the feelings that are evoked by color and texture and typography. And you might already think of these atmospheres in different terms. You might call it feel or mood or even visual identity. But however you describe it, the atmosphere of a design doesn't depend on layout. It's going to be independent of arrangement or visual placement. And it's going to be seen or felt at every screen size and on every device. So this idea of working on components out of context has been gathering pace over the last few years. And if it sounds a bit strange, We've been abstracting design in this way for a long time. For example, when we use mood boards, or even when we look at cropped dribble shots. Now, in his article, Content Choreography, Trent Walton wrote, web designers will have to look beyond the layout in front of them to envision how its elements will reflow and lock up at different widths while maintaining form and hierarchy. And I really appreciate that approach, because separating components from layout can help everyone to focus on their design while setting no expectations of how those components will be arranged across responsive screen sizes. So I said earlier that we love to identify patterns to create systems because we crave predictability. That's why we're always searching for the right process. But although the approach of separating components from layout and designing them independently has helped me improve communication like Samantha described, I know that it's not an approach that's going to work for everyone. And I know that it's not the right approach for every project, which is why I'm wary of defining it as a process. I'm wary because I've learned how important it is not to let our processes define what we make. You know, when I read about design process, I'm worried that we're simply replacing one set of design artifacts with another. In this case, Photoshop visuals for pattern libraries. And we're becoming so intoxicated by our processes and falling so deeply in love with our tools that we're actually in danger of losing sight of what we're making. So let's talk about how important it is to challenge ideas. You know, Sarah mentioned recently on the Big Web Show that this current trend for flat design leaves us more time for activities like research or data gathering. And back in 2009, wow, I gave a talk here in Event Apart called Walls Tumbling Down, where I talked about how important it is to make more time to be creative. And I suggested then that we should reduce repetition. We should make fewer high-fidelity visuals, and we should design systems instead of designing pages. But I think it's important to be clear that I was talking about designing a system, not design as a system. You know, design system thinking has taken hold, and it can take several forms. Everything from style guides as a design deliverable to full-blown pattern libraries as design tools rather than documentations. You know, there are some widely cited examples of pattern libraries, including one that's been made for A List Apart. And one design system that's become synonymous with responsive design is Brad Frost's Atomic Design. And Brad wrote about Atomic Design last summer, and he said, "Lately, I've been more interested in what our interfaces are comprised of and how we can construct design systems in a more methodical way." And then he goes on to describe how his atomic design system is comprised of atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and then pages. The end result of which should be, he says, a clear methodology for crafting design systems. Because of this, we can create systems that promote consistency and scalability. And by assembling rather than deconstructing, we're crafting a system right out of the gate. Now, Brad's inspiration for atomic design was chemistry's periodic table. I can't imagine anything less creatively stimulating, can you? Now, not everyone is convinced about abstracting design the atomic design way. Mark Bolton wrote about his concerns last year, and he said, "Conformity and efficiency have a price. That price is design. That price is a feeling of humanity, of something that's been created from scratch." What's being described here is not a design process, it's manufacturing. It's a cupcake machine churning out identical cakes with different icing, but they all taste the same. So I think it's really important to remember that creativity can never be, almost by definition, should never be, as predictable as a manufacturing process. And we need to be very careful indeed about attempting to rationalize creativity by molding it into a process. You know, Fletcher Nebel, he was an American writer born in 1911, and he said famously, "It's now proved beyond doubt that smoking is one of the leading causes of statistics." Now, Sarah mentioned finding more time for research and for data gathering. I'd be tempted to use that time for coming up with new, better ideas. Because you know what? No amount of research is a substitute for a good idea. At least not on its own. Peter Siebel, he's one of the designers at Etsy, and he wrote last year, "Science is powerful, and it would be silly to abandon it entirely. But it would be equally silly to think that science can somehow replace strong, talented designers. The goal should be to combine the two." So perhaps the most important lessons I learned at art school was not to take what we see and what we hear at face value and to question everything that we've been told. And I think it's something that everyone should do. You should question what you've learned here at this conference. You should question what I'm telling you now. I want you to always ask, can I do it better? And remember that just because something's been done doesn't mean to say that you can't do it better. You know, people always say that the sequel is never as good as the original, right? I suppose that's probably true when we think about Alvin and the Chipmunks. The Squeakquel. Actually, I haven't seen that. I know you have. But there are plenty of instances where the sequel's better than the original. I'm thinking of, obviously, Empire Strikes Back. Got to say. Raiders of the Lost Ark. No, sorry, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. What are you shaking your head for, madam? We're going to have an argument about this later on. Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. I rest my case. You know, there's nothing that we can't improve, and we should remember that we don't have to improve it for everyone. We just have to improve it for ourselves. And we're very fortunate in this industry that we've got the ability and the tools to take something that someone else has made, be that a small piece of code or a full framework, maybe it's a tip or a complete process or workflow, and improve on it. Blogs and RSS and Twitter, they mean that we'll hear about a new method probably minutes after it's been written up. And then tools like CodePen and GitHub, they let us fork that code and make it our own. You know, I published my open source contract killer on GitHub, and the best part about doing that isn't giving people a chance to use what I made, it's giving them an opportunity to add their own insights and to make it better. In fact, there's nothing that I've ever shared that hasn't been improved simply by the act of sharing it. But sharing it is just a catalyst. Developing an idea, now that takes time and it takes patience. So I should mention earlier that when I was at art school, I couldn't let a painting develop over a period of time. I had to work in high fidelity from the start. And my friend Ben, back then, and lots of the other painters around me, they knew how to let a painting develop. And what Ben did was he started the course by making 6 giant 6-foot by 6-foot stretchers. And he worked on those 6 paintings for the whole 3 years. And I think I saw Ben more in the pub than I did in the studio, because he'd come in once a week, maybe twice, and he'd add a new subtle layer of paint to each painting. And some weeks he'd come in and he'd dip a rag in white spirit and he'd take paint off the canvas. And I find that fascinating. The idea that we can make something better by taking part of it away, by reducing, by simplifying, rather than by adding to it. And it took a long time for Ben's paintings to develop, not just in terms of fidelity, but also in the purity of his idea. And I wonder now, looking back, did he have a clear idea when he started about what those paintings would develop into? I hope he didn't. I hope that he allowed his ideas to develop as he painted them. I should have asked him, really, shouldn't I? Whatever he thought, by the end of the course, Ben had 6 beautifully subtle, exquisitely layered paintings, and I could only dream of making something like that. Now, I think it's important to say that when we ask, can I do it better, when we challenge an idea or an implementation, that doesn't disrespect the idea or the person who shared it. I know that it can be a wonderful feeling to see something that you've made referenced, improved on, maybe even taken on a life of its own. And challenging something well respects the idea and the person who thought of it. But I know it's not always easy, particularly when we don't think of ourselves as equals with someone else, and it can feel uncomfortable to compare ourselves with someone else. But always remember that we each contribute from our own unique perspective, and that perspective is as equally valuable as any other. I work in my own little studio with my wife and one other designer, so our ideas on process and workflow, they're going to be very different from other people that work in small studios. And they're going to be different again from people who work inside large companies or organizations. But a different perspective can take an idea in a direction that its originator couldn't have foreseen or imagined. We can make an idea immeasurably better simply by looking at it from a different point of view. So you've all sat here watching speakers on this stage for the last 2 days. Has anybody wondered what it's like up here? Have you wondered how different the room looks or the people that are around you? Anybody want to come up? Chickens. Now, if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to come up here, if you don't want to stand on your chair in front of people, do that when you get back to work. Because something as simple and as foolish as standing on your desk can remind you that there are other perspectives, different ways of looking, alternative approaches to more or less everything. So challenging what we're told, questioning received wisdom, that's going to have its consequences, particularly when other people have a vested interest in the things that we're challenging. And those consequences might be greater if you work in a large company or an organization than maybe if you work in a small company like mine. I built a business where it's possible for us to challenge conventions and to use new ideas without too many consequences. That's why years ago, when I wrote about serving one single typographic style sheet to all old versions of Internet Explorer across every site that we made, that wasn't just an idea. I'd already tried it out on my own clients for months, and nobody complained. Both of the books that I wrote about seizing the potential of new techniques and new technologies, whether that be designing in a browser or pushing ahead with cutting-edge experimental techniques. And those ideas might seem mainstream now, but when we write about things, sometimes the reaction is less than complimentary. And I think sometimes that reaction comes from a reticence to change. It's also possible that it comes from fear, and too often we limit an idea's potential because we worry about the consequences of failure too early. How many times at work have you seen a great idea dashed just because someone says, oh, we can't do that because? Children, they challenge ideas all the time. They've got a real talent for asking questions. They ask why all the bloody time. If you've got kids, you're going to know that. Because they haven't learned to fear consequences in the way that we have, because they haven't been conditioned to think about those consequences. So rather than dimming the flame of an idea, questioning it helps to make it grow. So we should ask more questions. We should make asking questions a habit. Who says I can't do that? Why can't we do that? Why do we have so many meetings? Why do designers and developers work in separate teams? Why do we work in separate buildings? Why can't I start writing code until the design's signed off? Why can't I talk to the client? Why is this list of questions so long? Asking these types of questions can stimulate ideas. And always remember that whatever environment we work in, along with any consequences, come opportunities. Opportunities to create something that's special. Finally, let's talk about beating our own path, not walking someone else's. You know, for 15 years, I worked mainly on my own, and when I look back now, I realize that how much I struggled, actually, without the stimulation working with other people. And I don't think that I could have succeeded were it not for that self-motivation that I learned back in art school. And we can feel isolated. We can feel starved of inspiration, even when we work alongside people, if our organization structure and our working environments make it hard to keep ideas flowing. So it's common for our organizations to classify us in much the same way that we classify elements when we write HTML, except that we're given role attributes. How geeky is that, right? Roles like graphic designer or user interface designer, user experience designer, digital product designer, web developer, front-end architect. Did I miss any? How does your work categorize you? But of course, it's what's written on your business card doesn't necessarily restrict you coming up with ideas, but classifications can have consequences that impact on creativity. So when you define a role for yourself or you're assigned one by someone else, at best, that role can limit what you do, but at worst, it can limit what you aspire to do. Roles and responsibilities can define boundaries, and I've seen protecting those boundaries become battles over territory. If you're a UX designer, if you're a web designer, how would the UX professionals that you work with feel if you made wireframes? I've worked with people who are very touchy about designers encroaching on their territory. And by the same token, how do we designers react when maybe front-end developers make decisions that affect layout when they're implementing a design? Do we react negatively? Have you ever heard a designer say, but that's my job? But when we cross over into someone else's area of expertise, when we work with their tools, we use that new perspective. It can inspire us to move in a different direction. Stepping into someone else's shoes not only gives you an appreciation for their work, but it can also inspire us to make our own work better. Separating people into, for example, a team of experienced designers, another team of visual designers, maybe another team of developers, that can have a tremendous impact, not only on the flexibility of a project, but on how ideas flow between those teams. You know, the most successful projects I've worked on in recent years have been the ones where instead of working in specialist teams, the client created a project team. And that included people from all disciplines, designers, developers, content specialists, and we worked alongside each other in a single space, and we had an open door policy. And that encouraged everyone in the organization to come in and look at what we were making, and this fed us ideas constantly. Coincidentally, it also helped with things like impromptu user testing and device testing, because everybody brought their phones in with them. And the best projects for me are always the ones that are filled with questions, because they prompt us to be creative with the answers. The late Aaron Swartz wrote, "Be curious, read wisely, try new things. I think that a lot of what people call intelligence just boils down to curiosity." And often curiosity is a trait that we've lost. So as well as asking why, we should perpetually also be asking what if. You know, this year is the 10th anniversary of many groundbreaking articles that were published on Listapart. And those articles made it possible for us to do what we do today when we're making websites. And many of those authors simply asked, what if? People like Doug Bowman, who's now creative director at Twitter, bit of a backstory. Way back in 2002, a gentleman called Mark Newhouse had already written about how we can turn an unordered list in HTML into navigation. We take that for granted today, but those lists still looked boxy. And honestly, people complained then that CSS designs were boring. Some might say flat. So what Doug did, he asked, what if I used 2 background images to make tabs? And he invented something called sliding doors of CSS. Dan Cederholm, he's the co-founder of Dribbble, 10 years ago, no one had solved the problem of how to make the background of 2 unequal columns the same height using CSS. And Listapart published Dan's faux columns where he asked, what if I just cheat and put a repeating background image on a parent container? Also that year, Patrick Griffiths asked, what if I use ems for layout instead of pixels or percentages? And he invented the concept of elastic design. Dave Shea from the CSS Zen Garden also said that year, what if I put all of my icons into one single image? And he invented CSS sprites. And that's something that stood the test of time. We still use it today. So those questions, those what-ifs, they helped to spark ideas that went on to change the way that we design and develop websites for the next 10 years. And being curious works just as well today as it did then. For those people who made it possible for you to be sitting here learning about websites using HTML and CSS, and us that stand up here talking about it. You know, what if we use a different design artifact to communicate design? Ask that, and your next idea might be style tiles. What if we start working in a browser instead of Photoshop? We might have a more nimble process. What if we use mobile first? What if we use fonts for icons? Those are the questions that we should be asking. So to sum up, really, being at art school taught me a lot of things. In fact, I think that I learned more about work and about business and about myself than I did about art. And I think I've remembered and I've tried to apply the lessons that I learned in everything that I've done in the 30 years since then. And for half that time, I've worked for myself. I made websites for people. So the lessons that I learned about staying motivated have been invaluable. And I don't forget that. Art school taught me the most important lesson in my working life, and that's to be adaptable. Because as you can imagine, I'm in a very different place now than I could have imagined back then. And you're going to be in a very different place in 10 years than you can imagine now. So don't forget that either. Finding a medium that expresses your interests and your talents is vital. And at the same time, I've learned that it's too easy to become intoxicated by a process and to forget what really matters, which is ideas. It's too easy to fall deeply in love with our tools, be they the kind of printmaking tools that I used at art school, or today's favorite application or fashionable framework. Because used thoughtlessly, any tool or process can become a distraction. I don't want to forget that lesson. And I also don't want to forget the people that made it possible for me and all the other speakers you've heard of over these last 2 days to stand up here and share what we know. I can't think that there's another industry where people share what we discovered so freely with complete strangers. And that's what I hope that you'll do. Take what you've learned here and go and make something that's better. Then most importantly, Share what you make so that other people can learn from it. Be generous with your ideas. Seth Godin said recently on a podcast with Sarah, the generosity of standing up and speaking comes through. We have to acknowledge this to ourselves, the decision to be generous and to stand for the work that we do. So that's the most important element of branding that matters as we go forward. So, what is a modern designer's canvas? It's not Photoshop or Sketch. It's not a pattern library or a style guide. It's not breakpoints or media queries. It's none of these things. It's up here. It's in our minds and in our ideas. But it's also out there in the people that we inspire. And they really are the best, most important, and longest lasting work that we can make. Thank you very much for an incredible 2 days.